Well, happy 4th of July, my fellow Americans, and also to the rest of those poor bastards out there who may not be able to call themselves that. Hi, I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and this is your 4th of July special edition of Right Angle, made possible by the members of BillWhittle.com, who come to us from all around the world because America's an idea. Guys, we were, as Steve did a segment this week on America and where it stood on this birthday and how it's doing in terms of pride and stuff. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that Steve covered in terms of a Gallup poll that showed that American levels of pride appear to be falling somewhat. But when you dig into the numbers, it's like 47 or 48% of the total population feels extremely proud of America, and some enormous population, rest of it feels proud. But here's what's interesting about those numbers that I saw. Right now, the numbers of Democrats that feel extremely proud about America, I think, is 22%, if I remember the article correctly. And of course, that number dropped in half after Donald Trump was elected. But there was something buried in there that I thought was really interesting, and that was that they said that Republicans, during the entire Obama administration, Republicans never dropped below 60% of being extremely proud of their country. So Democrats were at about 44% extremely proud when Obama was president. The second Trump became president, that number fell in half. But Republicans maintained that 60% thing all the way through. I find that very interesting because we just have a story today, just 2 days before Independence Day, that Nike had issued a pair of commemorative shoes for the 4th of July called the Betsy edition. Just nice red, white, and blue track shoes with the Revolutionary War flag on the back, the flag with the 13 stripes and 13 stars in a circle. Well, after an outrageous amount of pushback, Nike canceled the shoes. And the outrageous amount of pushback consisted of Colin Kaepernick, who said that these shoes were racist and that the American flag, the revolutionary flag, is a code for white supremacist, Nazi, so on and so forth. So let's start with that, Steve. One guy who's benefited from this system more than the huge majority of the people who've worked their entire lives under it says, hey, man, this is offensive. Nike pulls the shoes and offends millions of people because one guy whose job is to be offended did his job and got offended.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The outrage mob, and this time it wasn't even a brigade of Twitter bots. It's just one guy mob. You know, there are two things that need to be said about slavery. One, it is maybe mankind's greatest evil. If not, it's certainly in the top three. And number two, it's depressingly common. People get away with holding slaves pretty much whenever they feel like they can. Slavery was only outlawed in Saudi Arabia, I want to say 1970. But even to this day, if you're rich enough, you can keep virtual slaves right there in Saudi Arabia, de facto, if not de jure. It's just awful. It's to use another person for your own purposes is just about the biggest evil there is. And this country fought a great civil war to put an end to that evil here where we could. And why does that not count? Why do the sons who volunteered and gave their lives to keep this country together and to rid it of slavery, why does that not count as our great virtue? If the fact that a few states at our founding held slaves is our great original sin as a nation. And I'm telling you, it is because of two things. Number one, there's a lack of historical perspective because people are taught pretty much that the only country in the world that ever held slaves was this one, when that's simply not true. As I said, it's depressingly common. And a cunning manipulation of this ignorance for political and cultural ends. Well, actually, the ends are cultural in order to wring control of the political, because as our friend, the late great Andrew Breitbart said, politics is downstream of culture. And so this is why we see this country culturally denigrated for sins it didn't commit and held as unique for common sins that it did commit. and I am sick to hell of it.
That is a profound, profound observation. I mean, I've heard the argument about we fought a war against slavery, because I was taught history. That's why. But the idea that this was an act of atonement is something that really needs to be discussed. Abraham Lincoln said that this horrible war that was killing so many of his own people, he said it may be that God expects that this horrible war will continue until every drop of blood drawn by the lash is matched by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, and that's the price that we paid. It's a remarkable piece of work. Scotty, the story goes on. Nike was about to move to the state of Arizona, some of their manufacturing plant or something, and one of the reasons they were moving to Arizona was that Arizona is an economically friendly place like Texas, and the governor of Arizona had offered Nike something along the lines of about $1 million in various tax breaks and so on in order to get the company relocated to Arizona. And within 24 hours of Nike making this decision, Republican Governor Doug Ducey said, "You know what, Nike, you can go make your goddamn shoes somewhere else." He didn't say that, but I'm saying it, and he basically said, "No, we're pulling the support. We don't want you here." That got him a lot of praise. A lot of Democrats, of course, said, "Well, this just proof that you're a white supremacist because you support the American flag." And I might add that immediately upon this decision, New Mexico governor, who happens to be a Democrat, said, "We'll take those jobs. We'd love Nike to come here." There is there is a party line distinction in this country about how we view America. Republican governor says, "Okay, you want to pull the shoes? Great. We're pulling our deal." The Democratic governor of New Mexico says, "Well, we'd love to have you here." When and how did this happen? It wasn't like this, growing up. The Democrats were not the anti-American party. Well, they were up until the Civil War, through the Civil War, but certainly in World War II and so on, everybody's on the same team. What happened?
I don't know if there's a natural progression of liberty that gets to the point where some people in the populace believe that the ultimate expression of political liberty is that you're free to be ashamed of your country. It seems almost weirdly ironic. If these same people were French citizens, if these same people were Spaniards or British, would they have that same view of their country? Is there almost a genetic predisposition for people to say that no matter how good we are, we can never be good enough. We must constantly be bathed in shame, not for ourselves, mind you, not for me. I mean, I'm a decent person. It's not my fault that those people were keeping slaves back then, but I think you ought to pay reparations to the former slaves on behalf of the former slaveholders. It just doesn't seem like a good long-term strategy for perpetuating humanity or for your ideals, this idea that somehow we've constantly got to feel bad about our country rather than looking at the positive side. Now, there are people who are generally positive in perspective, and there are people who are generally negative in perspective, and maybe that's part of it. It's not strictly political. But this idea that somehow by tearing down historical icons or by refusing to publish them or put them on the back of a sneaker, that somehow you're striking some victory for equality or for justice. It just seems to me to be an absurdity. And how far does it go? What symbols of America that existed before you popped out of the womb must be torn down now? And we've already decided, of course, that the Confederate flag must go, and I'm actually somewhat supportive of the idea that the Confederate flag doesn't need to hang over government buildings, although I think anybody who wants to should be able to have one in his front yard or on his pickup truck. But not that I'm going to engage in that, but I just think, it's a free country, let them do what they want. But At what point, when you're now saying, look, the progenitor of the stars and stripes that we now fly above all our government buildings, well, certainly that thing is a racist rag. So anything that came of it or after it certainly is just a descendant of that racial history and has to be struck as well. I just don't know how you can wake up every morning and feel this way. And frankly, I don't think any city or state or county ought to give any money or any breaks to any company to go anywhere. And so the fact that unless, if you want to provide economic incentive to get a company to leave your state, maybe that's sort of a self-defensive use of taxpayer dollars that may be worthwhile.
That's California strategy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But inadvertently. But I don't think that we should be luring people. So I'm glad to hear any state governor would say, hey, forget it, we're not going to give you this incentive. And I think that they ought to go the full length there and say, we're not giving incentives to anybody. If you like Arizona, come to Arizona. If you don't like Arizona, go somewhere else. But I think that ultimately you are going to create a bolus of people who are always angry, always ashamed, always disappointed, never satisfied with who they've become. And dear God, what is progressivism if it can't progress? What does that word even mean? If you can't move beyond your historical sins, why are you a progressive? And if you think that the way to move beyond your sins is to wipe out evidence of their previous occurrence, then I think you misunderstand the entire concept. If you want a better country, start being a better person now. And that means leaving other people alone.
Yeah. Well, progressivism is easy to understand. Progressivism comes to you with the message that says, we are here to change things. And if the country is already a good country, what do you need the left for? If this is a fundamentally decent place, a fundamentally fair place, a fundamentally, despite its flaws, because it is actually inhabited by real human beings, if it is making its efforts in a constant stream to improve this degree of fairness, if this is in fact the best place to live on the planet in terms of human freedom and dignity, then what do you need the left for? And one of the things that strikes me the most is that the people who are the most virulent anti-Americans still live in America. I find that rather interesting. I personally despise Nazi Germany. If I had found myself in Nazi Germany, I would have gotten out of Nazi Germany just as fast as I possibly could have. It makes me think there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. But I would like to leave you with one quick story, because there's another anniversary coming up. It's the anniversary of the moon landing on July 20th. It'll be 50 years. I recently did a very extensive set of programs on the Apollo anniversary, which we'll be promoting a little bit later. But there's one story in here that really, really got my attention. Because as far as I can tell, this story I'm about to tell you very briefly is the first time that I became aware of political correctness starting to do this business of making us ashamed of ourselves. Most people are not completely aware of this, but after Apollo 11 landed on the moon and the LEM was shut down and so on, Buzz Aldrin opened up a specialized packet that he had. He removed a little metal container. He removed a small package of items. He asked for silence from Mission Control and anybody who wanted to join him. And then he had communion on the moon. He was an elder at his church, Presbyterian church in Texas, and he poured the wine in 1/6 gravity. And he said it was really strange the way the wine curled up around the edges of their glasses. And he had communion on the moon. Well, here's where it gets interesting. NASA basically said to him, "Look, Buzz, if it's something you have to do, okay, but we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to broadcast it." And he said, "Why? We just landed on the moon. It seems to me the first thing we should be doing is thanking God that we got here and that we're still alive to tell the tale." "No, Buzz, we don't want to do that." And the reason that they didn't want to do that is because a few years earlier, just a year and a half earlier, on Apollo 8, astronauts returning from the moon, seeing the Earth rise above the surface of the moon for the first time in history, decided to read a few chapters of Genesis, and they read that Christmas message from Apollo 8, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." And here's what happened. Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was widely called the most hated person in America, not just by the people that disagreed with her, but everybody that ever worked with her. She's a tax a cheat, and awful to her kids and everything else. Madeleine Murray O'Hair sued NASA because the astronauts had the temerity to read from the book of Genesis as they were coming home on Christmas Day. And she lost the lawsuit. But she won the political correctness argument. And the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1969 told one of the two men who landed on the moon, both of whom thought that the chance of successfully surviving this mission was about 50-50, told him, you need to be quiet about what you believe in. You need to be ashamed of your religious beliefs. And we are going to make sure that your religious beliefs are absolutely excised from this experience because of one person. And this is the point I'm trying to make. Because of one person. One person has a problem with a nativity display on a town square that has been there for 160 years. And the people that backed down in terms of being the city fathers or whatever, back down because one person is outraged about this. This is the world we've come to find ourselves in. This is America in 2019, a world where one person or a small group of people, a microscopic group of people, can show enough outrage over something, and we back down. It's not their fault. They're outraged about everything all the time. There are some people out there just plain mean-spirited people, not happy with anything. When did we start to let one person tell the rest of the country what we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot think, and so on? How did we let this happen? Once we realize that it's us that allows us to happen, it can come to an end just like that. So I say good for you, Doug Ducey. Very good for you. I'm proud of you. And I think that if Nike wants to make these virtue signaling maneuvers, okay. Gillette tried that, and in another 2 years, I don't think anybody will remember what the name Gillette means. So if you want to play that game, that's fine. Free people have a right to respond as well. But on behalf of all of you people out there, you don't have to be a Christian to have been awe-inspired by the reading of the book of Genesis from the moon, from lunar orbit. That's not a screw everybody else kind of thing. Although, as an American, sometimes I do get into a screw everybody else kind of mood. And so I will close this message by saying, if you had a problem with that, and you think that perhaps it should have been a Muslim prayer service or a Zoroastrian kind of a ceremony, I say the moon is still out there, and you are more than welcome to go and launch your own missions, and you can say whatever the hell you want to on the way back home. But I don't see any reason why we have to be ashamed of what we believe in. And I don't see any reason why Buzz Aldrin, who took enormous risks, was made to feel ashamed by the agency that put him on the moon in the first place. That will do it for this edition of Right Angle, brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. Happy birthday, America. We're still here. The country's still here. We got your back, and the members have got our back, and we're going to keep doing this as long as that flag is flying anywhere. We'll be there. That's where we'll be. We'll see you next week on Right Angle.